Hey ladies and gentlemen, Spazzy Dragon here, aka Syndromes, and welcome back to Discovery Freelancer. It has been a while, and due to a popular request of exactly 3 people, we are coming back to you with Meet a Faction. Today with me, I have the ALG, led by Karst, and... Stop. Are you the
Hello,
leader, or were
viewers.
you... or were you the second in command?
I am the 2IC,
Yeah,
but I am a
see...
longtime leader of this faction.
Okay, then I'm keeping this in. Fuck it, let's go. Yeah, welcome back, and welcome to Karst. Hello, dear sir.
Hello, viewers.
Please tell us, who are you? Because obviously no one knows who you are.
Okay, so I'm Karst, and I have been playing this for about 13 years now, and a lot of them were spent with this faction. I'm pretty enthusiastic about it, as probably most of the remaining players will know, and I'll be very happy to talk about it.
Good man. So actually, let's talk a little bit about the faction itself. The way we're going to do this is we're going to separate it into a TLDR of what the original faction was about, how it was described, you know? Because usually
Yeah,
corporation factions are not really given too much lore. So talk about
no.
ALG as it was presented first, and what is the ALG now and how it is represented by your ID.
Well, ALG is without a doubt one of the more niche corporate factions, and one that frankly does not have a lot of original lore to work off of. There isn't even an explanation for what the acronym ALG actually means. So we've sort of had to make a lot of it up. Now, what we do know is ALG in vanilla is in a triumvirate alliance with Gateway, Shipping, and the IMG. And they're presented as much as you can be in this dystopian environment, the good guy corporations. The the traditional big house corporations like Dauman and Samura and BMM and all those are sort of the bad guys, and Gateway and IMG and ALG that are less tied to the house governments are the good guys. That's sort of the basic idea in vanilla lore. They're more open to not being super hostile to unlawfuls. They treat their workers better, and they're sort of up and coming, whereas the old dinosaurs of the houses are, evil and treat their workers badly and are very radically opposed to all the unlawfuls.
And when it
So
comes
that's
to
sort
the
of the
vanilla
basic setup.
lore, what ALG actually did? Like, how were they described?
Well, they're an industrial company, so they're specialized in chemical products and metallurgical products. In particular, they make mocks and ship hull panels. That was their original setup. Um, it was described of how they make mocks more efficiently than the Bretonians because they're using recycled waste or whatever. And the same is true for the ship hull panels. Like they bring in recycled products, scrap metal and toxic waste, and make chemical and metallurgical products out of them. That's their setup.
You know, funnily enough, it's that recycled part that has, like, I've never really been a lot interested in actual corporation factions, apart from, pirating them, because mostly I was spending my time on unlawful characters. And ALG has always struck me, and it's just my personal perception, although I know for a fact that it was shared by many people, that they were basically the garbage men, and it was kind of like a running meme, but the way that you describe it right now as the vanilla experience, it's a little bit more in depth than that, but obviously
Well,
recycled things is kind of the theme of that faction.
I'm afraid Discovery development has done this faction a great disservice in that regard, in that possibly due to the full name of the IFF being ALG Waste Disposal, has
Oh,
sort of treated them as really just being that, as just being like, a recycling company, a garbage company, which is absolutely not the case. There is a lot of people who have talked to me about ALG will know how I love to bring this up, but there is a vanilla rumor of how ALG is preparing to compete for the next generation Rhineland battleship construction contract. So they are in vanilla by no means a company whose exclusive business is waste disposal. And Discovery did not help this when they introduced the unique commodity of these hazmat canisters, which that's
yes.
cool and all, but like it's just reinforces the image of they are just a waste disposal company, which really is not the case in vanilla, and I certainly do not wish to be the case now.
Although, you say that, but back when the first Rhineland/Liberty War broke out, it was kind of interesting because ALG was always considered and viewed as a strictly Rhineland corporation, although it has ties with, the aforementioned corporations. But they were one of the few Rhineland corporations that were, without a doubt, allowed just to enter and fly around Liberty. And
They were the only one, in
yeah,
fact.
and I strictly remember having to babysit them on my lawful indies because people will go like, "Oh, Rhineland bad," and try to shoot them, and it's like, "Don't shoot the garbage man."
Yeah, it happened to me as well. And I would like to go on a little bit of a short tangent here because
Please do.
this is actually quite interesting for the faction. Now, they were allowed in Liberty during the Rhineland-Liberty War as the only Rhineland faction because they're a bit more of a House independent faction. They're a bit more like Crier, which is by ID a Liberty corporate faction, but like ALG, they don't have the wartime piracy lines on their ID. They don't have the can engage in piracy against ships affiliated with houses at war with Rhineland. ALG doesn't have that either because they're sort of they're not the super Rhineland involved house corporation. Now, anyway, they were allowed in Liberty, but under very heavy restrictions, and um, crucially, they were not allowed to mine premium scrap, which is something that they can do. And they requested it and were brushed off by the Liberty government. So they had sort of this shadow existence where their essentially only activity was illegal. And they based out of junker bases. And then we formed ties with the lane hackers because kind of we weren't really happy existing lawfully in Liberty anyway, and there wasn't a lot we could do. And as a result of that, ironically, despite being the only one who was allowed there during the war, after the war, ALG kind of ended up being the one that's the least friendly to Liberty because the others just came back in and it was fine. They didn't have any bad history, but ALG did. And they already had these sort of shady ties in Liberty. So that sort of flipped around, interestingly.
So, quick question: considering you're a Rhineland, a Rhineland-tied corporation, Rhineland-born corporation, the immediate question I would have is, what is your practical zone of influence? Like, where do you spend the most time these days?
Well, at the end of the day, as much as I've challenged the premise of corporate factions being just traders, ALG is, for the most part, a trade faction. And as such, we kind of trade all over the place. Now, we've had some pretty varying diplomacy and some pretty serious conflicts among the houses, but at the moment we are allowed in every house, and so you might find ALG trade ships pretty much everywhere. Now, ALG also can mine. We have mining bonuses on um, scrap, regular and premium, and toxic waste, and uranium or military salvage, which are kind of strewn all across the map. We're quite close to the uranium field here in Sigma 15. It's just neighboring Sigma 21. So that is a place you might go as an ALG player to mine uranium. And yeah, then you might be flying across Sirius. In terms of the actual ZOI, like other house corporations, it is just Rhineland plus a couple neighboring systems and nearby systems.
Could you tell, especially for someone like me who has not played Disco for quite a while now, could you give us a very TLDR situation of the overall state of diplomacy between all the houses, and also the current kind of situation in Rhineland, like more in-depth situation, how the Rhineland uh, diplomacy is, and how it impacts you specifically on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, well, I'm going to very briefly cover the overall diplomatic situation between the houses because that's,
Yeah, who's hostile to
that's
who,
not really
and
ALG specific.
yeah,
But at the current time, there are no wars active between any of the houses. The most recent one was between Kusari and Gallia, um, and the most recent one before that was between Kusari and Rhineland. But at the time, there are no active wars, although the tensions between Gallia, Kusari, and Bretonia are extremely high. Those military and intel factions associated with those houses have special engagement lines in the towers because they're supposed to be like a high tension environment and they are sort of shooting each other. So Gallia and Bretonia and Kusari are not not openly at war, but they have quite bad relations. Now, as for Rhineland in particular, the most relevant for us development was the fairly recent Rhineland Civil War. Now, in the Civil War, um, Daumann, Kruger, and Rhineland military, primarily, backed the monarchists. So there was a monarchist coup. They wanted to restore Imperial Rhineland, and they were supported by Daumann, Kruger, and RM for the most part. Whereas ALG and BDM formed the Democratic side, with support from the Bundschuh and the Hessians, who sort of hated the monarchists more than they hated us.
yeah.
But this has had dramatic effects on ALG's diplomacy. They are now within their house in a position perhaps comparable to Gateway, where the government sort of deals with their competitors almost monopolistically, and they're sort of unfriendly within their own house. Now, within ALG's diplomacy sheet, which is supposed to be, now, we've sort of touched on this before, the player faction and the NPC faction and the lore.
Yeah.
The player faction is obviously not 100% what the faction would be in the storyline, but it's supposed to be canon compliant as much as possible.
I will
Um,
very quickly ask you one thing,
mhm.
and I was supposed to ask this a little bit later, like earlier, but I didn't write it down for myself. But um, in terms of representing the NPC faction, are you representing the NPC faction as the 100%, like you are the ALG, or are you a smaller group within the ALG with specific privileges and roleplay consequences?
The the intention is absolutely to represent ALG, the company, the lore entity as a whole.
Yeah,
We are not playing a sub ranch or anything. We do intend. I mean, ALG is currently not an official faction. We actually just recently reapplied, but they were official for a very long time. And ALG doesn't really. The thing is, ALG doesn't really have competition in this field because
yeah.
there has never been a situation where there was more than one ALG faction competing for the spot. It's always been a niche faction, and we very much do intend to represent the NPC
Yeah,
faction as a
see,
whole.
the reason why I asked is obviously we'll get to that point in a moment, but some factions in the past have specifically stated that they are role playing and they're representing a smaller minority within their own lore, so that they have the privilege of having some slightly more outlandish roleplay ideas, or
Yes,
some highly more specific diplomacy or in-game behavior that might not be associated with their faction.
this
So,
is more typical, I think, for um, Navy factions and unlawfuls, where
Yeah.
it's like you're role playing a specific battle group or a branch that's more militant or less militant or something like that. With a corporation, you don't typically see that. You usually don't see them playing like a subset of the corporation.
So yeah. All right. So continue on. Like, tell us how ALG is currently, standing out on the background of its like original lore, and today in 2022, how is it, you know, specifically being represented within the
Yeah,
current
I'm
game
going to go
environment?
back to the ALG's position within Rhineland.
Yeah.
Now, um, in the Civil War, where ALG was on the Democratic side, and the Democratic side sort of lost the war. I mean, they didn't really lose it, but it was a compromise that was in favor of the other side. Um, and as a result, they have this unfavorable position and also have taken a lot of losses. I mean, it has to be said that ALG in lore in 829 in 2022 is weaker than they were 5 years ago. The former headquarters, we're sitting outside ALG's current headquarters, Richter Station. Their
Hmm.
old headquarters was in the middle of New Berlin and Dortmund Station, which is a wreck now.
Oh.
And this is sort of um, this is emblematic of ALG's development as a whole. Their headquarters are no longer in Rhineland space. In fact, they don't actually have any bases within Rhineland house space, not counting um, Neu Augsburg and Munich, which you really can't count. That's sort of a developmental dead end. That's not really going anywhere in that dead system. Um, but they have thoroughly moved away from Rhineland, quite literally in this case with this station in the Sigmas. The closest relationship that ALG has within Rhineland is the Bundschuh,
Oh.
and they're basically unfriendly to all the lawfuls and all the other corporations.
So not having actual physical representation within Rhineland, it kinda does help for you to be, not really friendly with the house that you're originating from.
Yeah, it's sort of a logical consequence.
Yeah.
The the Democratic side in the Civil War, the participation of the BDM on the Democratic side was more or less spontaneous. That sort of was generated with the Civil War, whereas ALG kind of already had been moving in that direction with a couple of developments. First of all, Rhineland becoming way more hostile over the years to the IMG, and the IMG are ALG's closest ally. That alone sort of tells you something because their closest ally in vanilla also wasn't a Rhineland faction. It
Yeah.
was an outside faction. And um, Rhineland started really stepping up the legislative and other pressure against the IMG, which we didn't like. And then the Sigma War started against the GMG. So there was another war between Rhineland and the GMG, classic
Classic.
matchup.
Yep.
And ALG, of course, rather likes the GMG. So they did not participate in that. They spoke out against it. They lobbied against it, did what they could. And just like in the Liberty War, they were the only Rhineland corporation that was then allowed entry into Kusari when they finally joined the war and it became the Kusari Rhineland Sigma War. Um, and then the Åland War happened, where um, the Kingdom of Bretonia attacked the IMG because they wanted to capture Åland Shipyard because Southampton had been destroyed,
Yeah,
so that they
they
could
needed a
make
place.
warships for
Yeah.
the war with Gallia. And ALG helped their allies and became hostile to Bretonia. And Rhineland was sort of upset about this because they don't really like the IMG and they hate the IMG more than they are concerned about Bretonia being like super hostile at their border. And so there was a parliamentary inquiry and there were sanctions placed upon ALG. In fact, ALG was actually briefly no-doc within Rhineland well before the Civil War as a result of that situation. They were cleared of the charges and but that the point of time where they were cleared of the charges in that investigation was almost immediately before the Civil War started. So that got and that ended up not mattering all that much. But the point is, at the time that the Civil War broke out, ALG was already, frankly, not all that comfortable within their house of origin.
Okay, so as we are currently moving on 20 minutes in, what about your players in general? So we are currently having this situation where the ALG is a house corporation with actually very minimal ties to their house. But
Yeah.
how is it portrayed in the actual gameplay in game? So we're moving from the lore side to the in-game actual action side. So, for example, for those people who potentially want to join ALG, make an ALG character, and experience a slightly more unique twist on the idea of a, quote, corporate faction, what it is that you do in-game physically on a day-to-day
Okay.
basis.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this current faction. Now, you may have noticed that recent posts and the actual info page that I linked are posted by the ALG 2022 faction account.
Yeah.
I had been inactive and the entire faction had been essentially non-existent. They still have their old info page and everything, but um, they they were inactive. And now I came back at some point and noticed that there were some players who were actually playing ALG, and they had made a new faction account and were doing stuff. And I got in touch with them, and they showed interest in continuing their ALG as the old faction. So they originally formed this faction as very much a casual venture of just people who want to like trade and stuff together.
Mhm.
And I sort of pushed them into like, hey, do you want to be a bit more lore and go a bit more in depth? And they were very much open to it, which is why we ended up merging. This faction now is a merger of these new active players who are motivated to play ALG and basically our old lore story and everything. Now, what you can do nowadays, like I said, it is at the end of the day still a corporate faction, and most people that are attracted to factions like this, even if they're weird and unorthodox like ALG, probably want to primarily trade. And you can very much do that. Like I said, we have these mining bonuses across Sirius. There's a fair bit you can mine and trade. We have this good diplomacy. But more than that, we also have interesting roleplay opportunities. Now, a lot of I'm afraid this is always a problem with a faction like this is that a lot of the players that are attracted to it tend not to be super interested in the faction's roleplay. But for those who are, you can sort of you have opportunities to do stuff with factions that other corporations probably don't usually do roleplay with. Like the Order is probably the best example. We have this very long-standing good relationship with the Order. You know, you can go out to the Omicrons and deliver some stuff to them, roleplay with them perhaps, or the Lane Hackers, or the Bunchu, or Oxo for that matter. As for the ID itself, now you can't the okay, so I have to put a massive caveat here. The current ALG ID, I don't have one because it's an SRP ship, but you do. And this is not up to date. This is a Civil War era ID. It says can attack ships belonging to factions considered hostile by the Rhineland United Republic, which doesn't exist anymore. That's a Civil War era thing. Um, that's not really supposed to be there anymore. Uh, I don't know if we need more extensive development to change that or if we just want a quick fix, but in any case, what they can do is shoot enemies in their ZOI, which is basically Rhineland. Now, the main enemies in that ZOI would be the Unioners, who ALG really hate. They don't really, well, they're allied to the Bunchu, and they don't hate Hessians either. They're sort of neutral-ish. But Unioners and Corsairs are sort of the main enemies. If you want to log ALG to shoot somebody, you would be shooting Unioners and Corsairs. And aside from that, you can also pirate all of the other Rhineland corporations outside of house space. Now, the line against Republican slash Imperial slash RGS shipping the ever name-changing faction is a Civil War era thing that's not supposed to be there anymore. But the one against Dauman and Kruger very much is. So that is a thing that you can do, pirate Dauman or Kruger outside of house space, which I quite enjoy doing. So yeah, there's some options besides trading that you would have.
This is actually really interesting because I really do love when a faction's diplomacy in current situation is open enough where if I make a character, I have the ability to explore a little bit more diverse, like divergent ideas to personal roleplay. So my immediate question would be, for example, a player joins and he wants to focus on his character and character development, and he wants to play a faction that has a slightly unorthodox or looser, situation with
Yeah.
its diplomacy. So even as a completely new character and a completely new participant in the faction, how much this person has a leeway with his character before he starts risking interfering with the goals of the faction. And by the way, what are your current goals? Like, what is the
Well,
you know the
this
thing
this
the
was
thing that you're doing, and the thing that you would kind of have these new players avoid messing up if they want to do their own thing.
this was a major discussion point because of how we merged the old concept of ALG, which no longer had an active faction, with these new players that were very motivated to play an ALG faction. And I had to kind of go up to them and ask them, do you share this vision? Because that's not necessarily obviously the case, especially since, the vision involves we're moving away from Rhineland. We basically don't like anybody in Rhineland except the Boonshu. Um,
What a
and
weird world.
yeah, I mean, that sort of would be the potential point of conflict. Like within this faction, I, there wouldn't be any room for somebody who's like, oh yeah, we should be super close buddies with like Dauman and Kruger and be really friendly to the Rhineland state. Like that would be a no-go. That doesn't fit into what
Can
the
their
faction is
character,
currently
would you
doing.
allow their character to do that? As long as
Well,
it
I
doesn't
mean,
screw with your...
if their character is like a transport pilot or something, it doesn't really matter. Like they can think whatever. But I mean, if they want to creatively shape the faction's roleplay, then it would be a problem if they have a substantially different idea of where the faction should be going. I mean, little bit of a spoiler here, but I would frankly prefer if the faction ID in general were actually just straight up no longer a Rhineland corporate faction, but an independent corporate faction. That I suppose.
It kind of
Since you
does
asked
feel
about
that
goals,
way.
would well, I mean, we no longer have any bases in Rhineland. Frankly, I'm not sure why we are still a Rhineland faction. We really kind of conceptually aren't. And this is, it has to be said, also going to be a source of major controversy because there are obviously people who are like, why is ALG doing this? Why are they, not just being traitors in within their house and like being friendly to their house police and military and their other house
Yeah,
corporate
the obvious
factions
question would
like other
be,
yeah.
is this like uniqueness for the sake of uniqueness, or do you have something specific in mind?
Well, um like I told you before this interview, I really don't want to quote the the ALG info page, but I think it does an extremely good job of
So
setting the
please quote
historical
away.
well, of setting the historical background, which I've sort of briefly gone over here anyway, but this isn't like a this is not a situation where I came along and was just like, oh yeah, I want ALG to be something totally different from what their established lore is, which frankly there wasn't a ton of to begin with, but whatever. Um, no, this is very much the result of what I think are natural developments. There are reasons why ALG is in this position. This isn't just something that was made up one day by a player who just wants to be different.
That's actually really true because, like, considering the overall progression of the whole situation, especially with Rhineland in general being one of the major, kind of influencers towards the state of the faction, it's actually kind of interesting because I know for a fact I've been a part and I've led factions that are kind of cemented into their vanilla lore, and to see ALG kind of just going with it and breaking free and just kind of just sandboxing itself is a pretty neat thing. And when you say that it has the potential of not being a Rhineland corporation anymore, I can completely see this. Like this seems like a natural overall possible development of events. It actually makes
Yeah,
sense.
I'd like to think that it developed quite realistically and naturally. And I do, I mean, I know I said this before, but I do need to emphasize that um, ALG very much is worse off. Like, and because we're doing this sort of very independent thing, and a lot of things have heavily changed, especially with the Civil War. Um, we risk accusations of like, oh, you're sort of power gaming this. You want to
Be
do your
more
own
than
thing
you
and just
are.
be more than you are. And I do need to emphasize that ALG is less than they were. Like they have lost most of their stuff. They are a smaller and a weaker company than they were in vanilla or just a couple of years ago. So I mean they're doing things differently, but it's a difficult situation, and I would like for ALG to moving forward be played as a faction that is in trouble, that is not doing so well.
So basically, stability provides chances for activity. Would be
Oh, it's
or
rather
rather
the
the
opposite.
the
Instability, yeah.
instability. Yeah. So,
Yes,
and
yes.
as the last question, as we're slowly running out of time, we explained and kind of looked into what the faction can potentially offer for a new player in terms of activity and stuff like that. But let's very quickly look from the opposite side. What kind of player, not the character, but what kind of player are you actively looking for? Do you want someone who does can bolster your PvP capabilities, or are you looking for someone to actively help you shape the faction and its development with their own roleplay activity and stuff like that? Like, what kind of players are you actively looking for?
Well, in times past, I would have said that we are specifically not looking for people who just want to power trade. I'm not going to say that anymore because frankly, the numbers aren't really like that anymore, where you can choose to be that way. But what I will say is that, yes, sure, you can join ALG because you want to join a corporate faction to power trade on. That's fine, and it is a good faction to power trade as. But I would, of course, prefer to see players who are interested in the lore and the roleplay of the faction, who are like, when we have a complicated comm. Like we have this comm from Ox recently, where they want to do research and development RP around sort of capital ship weapons, which is, complicated RP. And I would like to see players that are interested in like doing sort of more complex, not just POB supplying and power trading RP, but are willing to look a little deeper into it. And
Active
frankly, I
roleplay
am
development.
also, yeah, I will mention this specifically. I am also interested in PvPers. Like this is traditionally quite difficult for corporate factions. Usually, PvP enthusiasts don't think to look at corporate factions too closely, but as a result, of course, then you end up with corporate factions that don't really have any people that actually PvP. And it would be nice to have some people that are interested in PvP. This is not the most PvP conducive ID in the mod, but there are options, especially with active Corsairs and somewhat active Unioners. There are potentially things to shoot and things to pirate.
Alright, ladies and gents, I think this is going to be where we stop, unless there's any other quick topics you wanted to bring up.
Um, No, I think it's been covered quite well. I can only reiterate my thought that if you are in any way interested in this faction, or just in sort of Rhineland lore in general, go ahead and read the info page. It is very much up to date, which is frankly a pretty rare thing. There's a lot of info pages that sort of end with the Liberty Rhineland War 7 years ago or something. But this
What a
faction
time.
info page does have a lot of not only just ALG specific, but general sort of historical information about Rhineland. And yeah, a
Yep,
lot of
and
good
that
stuff in there.
and the link is going to be down in the video doobly-doo. And yeah. Alright, ladies and gents, thank you for watching this. With us was Karst, with us were ALG, and this is good night for now.
Cheers, viewers.